First, let me state that I'm really happy to be here. On the plane, I read an article about Uni IT, showing that, in fact, very novel educational methods are applied to create a lot of IT people in Ukraine. You're on the right path, and I think it's lovely, and you know, thumbs up for that. I see a lot of things happening. I'm impressed. Quickly about Luxembourg, a small country that's a center of Europe, that's be unadministered. It's the center of Europe because it sits really in the middle of 500 million consumers, and it has been the gateway for a lot of industries, in fact, into Europe. I'm not going to detail this, but to give you an example, in the early 70s, the Prime Minister said, well, we should build satellites. Luxembourg is a huge satellite hub in Europe. Very few people know about this. And he said, well, let's build this, but nobody wants to insure it, so we'll just bet half the state budget on doing the first satellite in Luxembourg. And they did it. That was a crazy idea at the time. Now it yields a lot of business. And the next crazy idea is for Luxembourg to say, well, why don't we start space mining, right? And why don't we start by creating a legal framework? So if you fly up there and you mine something on a meteorite that happens to pass by and can act as a catapult in your rocket so it comes back to Earth, in fact, by using a minimal amount of energy, well, there's a legal framework in Luxembourg saying it belongs to you. May make it worth the investment, right? So just to frame this, you know. It's a center in terms of finance for many things. First and foremost, it's a center, a huge booking center for funds. We got 3.6 trillion under management in Luxembourg. It's the second biggest fund hub in the world. People sometimes forget that. This, in concrete terms, means that, you know, huge financial institutions have their offices in Luxembourg, not necessarily their back offices. These are being partly outsourced, but it's really, really significant. If today you transact a fund part, you may not know it. In fact, it's happening through Luxembourg. In fact, in the late 80s, Luxembourg was the first country to subscribe to the UCITS, which is a fund standard that's very highly monitored. In fact, the Chinese are now inspiring their fund standard based on UCITS. It's probably the most known and safe fund standard in the world, right? So again, bear this in mind. I'm not going to talk quantities, but any type of fund going from equity fund, Leipzig and classic, to I want to build a fund, you know, that's based on bottles of wines, or we talked earlier today with somebody, why don't we create a fund that's based on kind of blockchain cryptocurrencies, in fact, what the Winklevoss brothers are trying to do in the States. Well, you can do that in Luxembourg. And it has an ecosystem around blockchain. Again, won't detail this to you. There's two things I want to talk about. First, we have a few labs, notably the one at Ripple, and we're doing meetups every second month. In fact, Stellar came to Luxembourg. Ripple is doing one this month. In fact, this place here, Distributed Lab, did a meetup. And those meetups, usually there's strong crowds coming from all over the financial community, the scientific community, and the regulator. So if you feel like you want to come to Luxembourg and demo something, I'm really insisting in that part. We don't want slides, we want people doing demos, and what Distributed Lab has done, I mean, it's pretty great in that regard, thank you. So that's one thing I want to talk about. The other thing I want to talk about is the one on the top called InfraChain. Here again, the government is saying, well, if blockchain is the next big thing, it's part of an infrastructure, and it needs an infrastructure. And we want to build a set of nodes in Luxembourg that are going to be like never ever done. They don't need to be physically located there, but we're going to create a framework for that. Coming back to what I said prior, if you're managing zillions of assets and have a very strong framework in terms of data privacy, data consistency, and data secrecy, as we have in Luxembourg with a lot of class 4 data centers, well, you may say, why don't we build the same thing for the up-and-coming blockchain technology, right? So that in a nutshell is about Luxembourg. Happy to talk more about it later if you want. Now I want to talk about the financial world, and I'll start by asking you a few questions. Who in this room, if you project yourself in 10 to 20 years, thinks that they're going to do most of their payments using this? Just raise your arms.
What is this?
It's a bill, basically. It doesn't matter if it's a bank bill, okay. Very few hands coming up, okay. Second point, who thinks that in 10 to 20 years they're going to do most of their daily payments using this? Okay, I see like 5 hands maybe in the room. Okay, that's still very good. And who thinks that they're going to do most of their daily payments using something that could look like this, a new form of this? Okay, right. Here we go, that's the majority, just testing. Well, in banking, we moved from a linear value chain where you were a waiting line as a client, right? That's how it used to look like. You had unavoidable intermediaries, the banks, the regulated entities who were in the middle between you, who wants to send money to somebody else, and the person who receives the money, or even on a different product, if you're like, have excess money and you want to put that into a saving, invest it, and somebody else was supposed to, need of money, an entrepreneur, and needed a loan, there are these intermediaries in the middle who said, well, I'll handle that. You need to go through me, right? And that's how it looked. And they had these great safety goals, right? Which are not always full of what you own actually. So that was a linear world with that kind of hold-up, and we're moving now to what I call the network-based service world. And basically, I simplified it into 3 avenues, really. So there's a demand and supply in terms of financial product. And by the way, you can apply that to other industries. I'm really schematizing this here. You have the old way, which is financial intermediary, right? Who's going to be in the middle there doing the whole work for you. You have the extreme new way, which is a purely based crowd solution. So there may be just somebody providing some kind of platform to that. That's it. Totally neutral, not even regulated. And some hybrids in the middle. And what happens today, we're in fact in a world with intermediation by choice. You choose your level of intermediation, right, today. That's a big change. And what this also means that in the past, as a bank, if you own the bank account of somebody, that single service ensure that finally you own the relationship, you own the whole product spectrum. So in fact, users of financial services in the past were firstly choosing a financial service provider, a bank, and from that they bought the product. Well, that has now totally changed. In fact, today somebody, the new generation, is looking for a financial service like a loan or just making a payment. They go to platforms, so whatever means they find, and basically they choose a product. And probably they don't care who's providing that product. It doesn't matter which bank is behind that, right? That's a new paradigm. Bear that in mind if you want to develop blockchain-based solutions. So I did something very discretionary. I took the technology and divided it in 3 really parts. The problem I see today is we talk a lot of blockchains. Some people say, oh, we can solve any problem with blockchain. And I don't think that's realistic. It really depends on what you want to do. And there are 3 parts to it. One is what I call a data part, right? The blockchain of data. There are different ways of doing that. The other part is the consensus. How do you reach agreement that a transaction is actually happening? Even there are big differences. I know there are a lot of Stellar fans in this room. And Stellar, to my mind, was very original by introducing the notion of quorum. So I heard the noise in the background, great, yeah. Where you can tailor that, right? The originality is to say, well, why don't you decide who is going to be approving? Why does everybody, like in Bitcoin, need to start calculating something? Does that even make sense? If you look at the banking world, the transactions which are huge between professionals, we know that, that this transparency link to that process doesn't really work. You say on one side, yes, you want to be effective, but you want to burn up tons of energy and share information that the law says you cannot share, actually. That's against the law, right? So to say, okay, I can choose basically the people who participate in my consensus, right, and who see basically what's happening there is a huge progress mentally speaking. This is not a technical progress as such. It's a progress that happened in the mind, right? And the blockchains use this are going to be the ones like Hyperledger and others, right, whom banks are actually going to use to make their transactions, right? And the third part is a ledger. Here again, there's this thing, well, a lot of ledgers are built and everybody can see everything, but the big challenge for a lot of people out there, especially people who transact assets, is say, well, I want to have a selective vision. And it's not going to be, somebody used the analogy of a dimmer, right? It's a vision where I can say, okay, my client and I can see the transaction, but the regulator needs to be seeing it too. But I need people maybe who do participate in consensus without seeing the transaction. Because I consider other banks to be like correspondent banks. That was a word in the past. You have a correspondent bank with a trusted relationship. And if that bank approves a transaction, that helps you. And even let me give you another example. If I'm somebody who wants to sell, to send Jimmy Joe $50 in the States, do I need to have thousands of people running algorithm in a computer? Maybe not really. Maybe if I know 3 or 4 trusted people, among them maybe banks I really think are valuable and trustworthy, that's enough. Maybe 5 are enough. So it introduced also the notion not of quantity, but quality of approvers, right? It's a big change, and my hats up for Stellar for that, really. But again, they're not the ones out there. So by looking at this purpose, in fact, I'm not going to run you through all this. There are different aspects, but I just want to trigger your thoughts there, right? What is exactly, which features do you need, right? Is this latency, settlement speed, complexity? Do you need a lot of complexity or not? What kind of quorums and so on? And again, I'm going to ask you, the other question I want to ask you today is the following. A lot of you started working on blockchain using probably one blockchain technology. How many of you will be ready to switch if they figure out that the use case they worked on is simply not best fulfilled with the blockchain technology currently used? Wow, that's a very low percentage. And that's one of the challenges I've seen out there. Without naming Ethereum, it's been used by a lot of people because Ethereum has a great side that it made it easier for a lot of people to access smart contracts, right? And I've seen a lot of people who are really innovators, and it's nothing against Ethereum, don't get me wrong, but who have been working for 18 months with that technology, and they just don't want to switch. And I said, well, what if a better one comes out? No, I've invested 18 months of my life, and no, I'm not going to switch. Okay, but you're going to see those banks who invested like 30, 50 years in some outdated system who don't want to switch, and you criticize them, so, oh man, they're old-fashioned, these bankers, they don't want to move, and they're unflexible. But you've been working 18 months on this thing, and you want to switch? Well, food for thought, right? Okay, but the hands up here were symptomatic of that. I'll wrap it up by saying the way it should be approached. Blockchain is going to come through with use cases, right? Is if you look at those different blockchains, and some have unique features. They're very small in here, right? They have strengths and weaknesses, and there's some missing features. And that leads to basically a set of applications. Some are better for payments, some are better for ID, some are better for other stuff, transacting complex assets or trade finance or stuff like that, right? We need to create a view on this, really. And basically, what steams all this is you look first at the user benefit out there, and then you look at the user solution. I mean, I talked about the example last night. Somebody lost a dog and said, can you help me with the blockchain on this? I said, well, no, it doesn't make sense. Just buy a whistle or call his or her name, or I don't know. So user benefit and the user solution, then basically you look at the blockchain technology you want to use, right? So go from the user. The problem very often is that people master a blockchain technology, and they're really kings at mastering it, and they try to tweak it to anybody who has a problem out there. And to make it work out there, and that's why I talk about the quorum changes and all that, is by starting basically at the user benefit. Having said that, I'm done. Thank you for listening. Open for your questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Frank. I don't even know which presentation I like most. They're all so cool. Okay, we have one question here. Sarina.
Thank you, Lydia. Hi, Frank. This is Sriram Venkataraman. Just a quick question for you. You showed the history of Luxembourg as a major financial center for funds and fund management, and with all the infrastructure that has been built over the last 40, 50 years. I'm pretty sure that you are feeling the same thing that I feel in the US, wherein the banks are not really ready to take the leap into the newer technology, or there's something like, hey, it's working for the last 40 years, 50 years, why should I change? Do you see that too?
Thank you. Great question. Yes, I see that part. Well, the banks are all there trying to find out what's happening with blockchain. They're all very curious. But yes, there's a challenge you look inside the bank, people to give up legacy system and huge investments. And they're also scared about losing staff. There's certain departments which we had looked at, and quite frankly, bluntly, 80% of people are going to disappear in those departments. It's rough just because of blockchain technology. That's what we forecast. But the interesting thing is that the employees that are more basically touched are not necessarily those who are sitting in Luxembourg or in Europe. They're partly sitting in those outsourced offices in Poland or in India, doing these recurrent tasks that don't add a lot of value. And that's where, in my mind, the biggest impact is going to be. So there's this social threshold, and there's this legacy threshold, and it's slow. And the biggest fear is not that some smart small bank comes up with a new way of doing business. The biggest fear is there's another big bank. That's why all these consortiums, right? Another big bank pops up and says, we're going full steam into this, and we got new solutions, and they cost like, I don't know, 10% of the price that the production costs were before.
Okay, we are ready to get one more question here.
Thank you, Lilia. Frank, and thank you for the great talk. Anatoly Knязев, Exante. Again, a very practical question from me. So I inquired about MTFs, and you mentioned that Luxembourg is the world's second biggest destination for funds, and I believe the first one is Caymans, right? Probably?
I would say number one is in the States.
The States.
Yes, the States. Cayman has dropped since 2008.
Oh, okay.
Image problems.
So anyways, in 2012, I've launched a Bitcoin hedge fund. It still operates from Caymans. Because as far as I was concerned, you couldn't have launched a UCITS, which was buying and trading cryptocurrency like Bitcoin. Again, at least back then you couldn't. So has anything changed? It's a very practical question. If I could do it, I'll probably do it this year. So could you?
Well, the question is, you don't necessarily need a UCITS to do this, right? There are other fund structures out there, and I think we can just take this conversation out here. UCITS, no, because of market making liquidity, but again, lots of funds come to market, like the funds based on mine, which are not UCITS, and there are solutions for that. There's a huge scope of funds out there, so there's a solution for what you're trying to do, I believe. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Frank. Thank you. It was a great presentation.